June 4th, 1942, the Central Pacific. Over the endless blue of the Midway Atoll, a formation of Japanese bombers cut through the morning haze like steel hawks. Below, the small American outpost looked defenseless, a mere speck of sand and coral surrounded by ocean on all sides. The radio in the operations bunker crackled with static. Then came the urgent voice. "Enemy plane sighted! Bearing 320! Sirens wailed. Mechanics sprinted across the airfield, hauling ammunition belts and fuel hoses. Every man knew what this meant. The Japanese were striking again. As the sky darkened with enemy aircraft, Marine gunners manned their positions. The first bombs fell seconds later. Explosions tore across the runway, throwing up clouds of sand and debris. Men dove for cover, but there was nowhere truly safe. Inside one of the hangars, Ensign George Gay of Torpedo Squadron 8 climbed into his TBD Devastator. The plane was outdated, slow, and vulnerable, but it was all they had. As his crewmen sealed the canopy, Gay glanced toward the rising smoke and muttered, "If we're going down today, let's make it count." At 07:10 a.m., Torpedo 8 launched from Midway. 15 aircraft in total, and none of them would return. They flew low, skimming the waves, straight into the teeth of the Japanese carrier fleet. The enemy's Zero fighters swarmed them almost instantly, cutting through the formation with surgical precision. Planes erupted into fireballs one after another. Still, Gay pressed forward, the ocean ahead boiling with tracer fire. He released his torpedo at point-blank range before his own aircraft was hit. It spiraled down, crashing into the sea. Floating amid burning wreckage, he watched as American dive bombers appeared out of the clouds above. SBD Dauntless aircraft, diving near vertically at the Japanese carriers. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were engulfed in flames. The sky turned black with smoke and falling debris. The Battle of Midway had turned, and with it, the entire Pacific War. By nightfall, Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and many of its most skilled pilots. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy had been beaten, and America's sailors knew the tide had begun to turn. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Of all the men in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, floating alone in the wreckage as the battle raged around him. He would later say, "I watched the whole war change from the middle of the ocean." In the months that followed Midway, Japan's empire began to tremble, but it did not collapse. While American headlines celebrated victory, the Imperial Navy was already preparing its counterstroke. The jungles and islands of the Solomons became the next battleground, a place where every bay, every reef, and every dark wave could hide an enemy. By early 1943, the Pacific was a graveyard of ships, destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers, all scarred by endless nights of combat. But amid this chaos, a new kind of warfare began to emerge. Small, fast, and deadly. The patrol torpedo boat, or PT boat, became the weapon of choice for those willing to risk everything. 80 feet of wood and raw horsepower, these boats weren't built to endure. They were built to strike. Powered by 3 roaring Packard engines, each PT could skim across the surface at over 40 knots. They carried 4 torpedoes, a 20mm cannon, and several 50-caliber guns, just enough to make every mission a coin toss between triumph and annihilation. In the Solomons, PT crews hunted convoys that the U.S. Navy's larger ships couldn't reach. By night, they stalked the Tokyo Express, Japan's supply runs through the narrow, treacherous channels. It was during these Blackwater missions that a legend began to form. Men who had once served on battleships now fought from the decks of small wooden craft, battling storm, darkness, and death, with nothing but courage and speed. One of those men was Lieutenant Commander Arthur McPherson, a survivor of Pearl Harbor and Midway, now leading a squadron of PT boats in the Solomon Islands. His orders were simple: stop the Tokyo Express, sink everything that moves. On the night of July 19, 1943, McPherson's three boats, PT-164, PT-168, and PT-171, waited silently off the coast of Vella La Vella. The moonlight shimmered across the waves as searchlights from Japanese destroyers sliced through the dark like knives. Each man aboard knew what would happen if they were spotted. One shell from a destroyer could turn their boat into splinters and fire. Yet no one spoke. Only the rhythmic hum of the idling engines filled the air. Then came the signal. All boats, execute strike pattern. The throttles opened wide. The Packard engines screamed, and the boat surged forward, leaving white wakes of foam against the Black Sea. Ahead of them, three massive Japanese transports moved in formation, their decks crowded with troops bound for Kolombangara. They never saw the PT boats coming. Within seconds, torpedoes sliced through the water. 4 bright streaks of death. Moments later, the ocean erupted in fire. One transport broke apart midship, another listed hard to port, spilling hundreds of soldiers into the burning sea. The Japanese destroyers responded with blinding fury. Their searchlights locked onto PT-164, and the night became a storm of tracer rounds and explosions. But the American boats vanished into the darkness just as quickly as they had appeared, ghosts of the sea, leaving only fire and wreckage behind. That night, more than 6,000 Japanese troops were lost. It was the first time Japan realized that even their mighty convoys were not safe anymore. The age of the PT boats had truly begun. Before those fiery nights in the Solomon Sea, there was a quiet place far from the front. A training base in Melville, Rhode Island. That's where America's first PT sailors were forged. The Navy called it the Motor Torpedo Boat Training Center, but the men who went there called it the Crucible. It wasn't just about learning to pilot small boats. It was about learning how to survive when the sea itself wanted you dead. Commander James Wild Jim Patterson ran the school with an iron will. His message was simple. The Japanese rule the night. We're going to take it from them. Training was brutal. Every exercise pushed the limits of endurance. Men learned to launch torpedoes at full throttle, fire machine guns while bouncing across waves, and navigate in pitch darkness using only the stars. They weren't traditional sailors. They were improvisers, daredevils, and problem solvers. Lieutenant Commander Arthur Mac McPherson, the same man who would later command PT-164, once said, "If you can't fix your engine, shoot straight and think fast. You won't live long enough to matter." Most of these crews came from wildly different backgrounds. Some had worked in shipyards, others were mechanics, fishermen, or college athletes. A few had never even seen the ocean before the war. But in Melville, they became brothers, bound by speed, danger, and trust. Every man had a role. The torpedo man handled the 2,000-pound Mark 13s, fragile and unpredictable weapons that often failed to detonate. The gunners manned twin 50-caliber Browning machine guns, their barrels glowing red from constant use. The engineer's world was below deck, an inferno of roaring Packard engines, the air thick with fumes and heat. And the skipper, the man at the helm, carried every life aboard in his hands. When McPherson's men graduated, they were shipped to the South Pacific, to a hidden dock at Rendova, a patch of jungle and mud that served as home base for Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9. Their mission? Intercept the Tokyo Express and stop Japan's reinforcements from reaching their front lines. The odds? Terrible. The conditions? Even worse. Rendova was nothing more than a muddy outpost. Mosquitoes swarmed the tents, diesel fumes hung in the air, and artillery from nearby islands rumbled day and night. The smell of salt, oil, and decay clung to everything. Still, the men laughed, played cards, and fixed their temperamental engines. Every night, they went out knowing it could be their last, but they never lost their spirit. Among McPherson's crew was a man named Thomas "Tom" Harrigan, a chief petty officer who had once worked on sailboats in Chesapeake Bay. He was the navigator, the man who could guide their wooden craft through reefs and fog using only the stars. There was also Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg, a math professor from Yale who could calculate firing angles faster than most could blink. Chief Motor Machinist Carlos Charlie Mendoza, who'd built racing engines before the war, kept the Packards alive when others would have given up. And then there was Patrick "Paddy" O'Brien, torpedo man, joker, and the crew's lucky charm. He polished each torpedo as if it were gold, whispering to them before missions, "Don't miss, my beauties. We only get one chance." They were an odd mix: city kids, farmers, mechanics, dreamers, all united by one thing. They refused to let the Japanese rule the night. Their first mission came sooner than expected. July 5th, 1943, just before midnight, rain hammered the sea like artillery fire. The wind howled across the deck, and visibility was nearly zero. Lightning flickered across the black clouds, revealing brief flashes of the jungle-covered islands around them. PT-164 led the formation, followed by 168 and 171, three wooden boats heading straight into one of the worst storms of the season. Their objective was simple: intercept a Japanese convoy running supplies to New Georgia. But in the Pacific, nothing was ever simple. As the storm worsened, radar screens filled with static, useless. The engines sputtered under the weight of pounding waves. Water seeped through the hull, soaking every inch of the deck. Still, the crews pressed on. For hours, they fought the elements, creeping through the darkness at 15 knots. Then, at Oro 300, the storm suddenly broke, replaced by a vast, silent blackness. It was then that they saw it, a long, dark shape sliding across the waves, bigger than anything they'd ever faced. A Japanese destroyer. Before McPherson could even issue a command, the enemy's searchlights snapped on, blazing white fire that turned night into day. For a heartbeat, both sides stared at each other. Then the sea erupted. Shells the size of milk jugs screamed through the air, detonating close enough to lift the PT boats clear off the surface. Tracers ripped across the waves like streams of molten light. Charlie Mendoza slammed the throttles forward. The Packards roared to life, their sound drowning out even the thunder. The boat leapt like a wild animal slicing through the storm. The Japanese gunners adjusted their aim. Water erupted in geysers all around. One shell tore straight through PT-164's starboard side, slicing open a fuel line. For a few terrifying seconds, flames flickered. But Mendoza, bleeding from a cut above his eye, crawled into the engine compartment and clamped it shut with his bare hands. The crew fired back with their .50 calibers, the tracers vanishing into the storm. It was useless. The destroyer was too far, too armored. Then McPherson shouted the only order that mattered. "Evasive maneuvers! Full speed!" The PT boats zigzagged wildly through the waves, engines screaming, bullets tearing through their wake. Somehow, by sheer will and luck, they escaped, disappearing back into the darkness. When dawn came, the sea was calm again. But of the 12 PT boats that had gone out that night, one was missing. Another had been so badly damaged it had to be beached on a nearby island. The survivors returned to base, soaked, silent, and exhausted. That night they learned their first hard truth. Courage alone wasn't enough. The Japanese still ruled the dark, but not for long. McPherson gathered his men that evening standing by the battered hull of PT-164. "We fought their way," he said quietly. "Next time, we fight ours." 2 nights later, they would get their chance, a chance to rewrite how war was fought at sea. 2 nights after that disastrous patrol, the men of Squadron 9 prepared to sail again. This time there would be no mistakes. Lieutenant Commander McPherson gathered his crews under a tarp lit only by a red lamp. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. "No more charging in blind," he said. "We strike from the shadows, once, fast and gone before they even know we were there." The men nodded. They'd learned their lesson the hard way. At sunset on July 19, 1943, PT-164, PT-168, and PT-171 slipped silently from the hidden dock at Rendova. Engines barely idling, they crept through the inky blackness toward Vela Gulf, where the Tokyo Express was expected to pass. There were no lights, no radio chatter, not even a cigarette glowing in the dark. Only the faint trail of phosphorescent plankton marked their movement, a ghostly green ribbon weaving through the sea. Hours passed in silence. Then, just after midnight, Ensign Dutch Vanderberg whispered from the chart table, "Contacts! 3, bearing 120. Through binoculars, McPherson saw them. 3 massive Japanese transports escorted by destroyers, moving in tight formation. Their decks were crowded with troops, thousands of soldiers bound for Kolombangara. McPherson gave the signal. Engines growled. The PT boats split apart, 164 veering left, 168 and 171 circling wide to flank the convoy. The tension was suffocating. Sweat ran down faces, hearts pounded against steel ribs. Every man gripped his weapon like it was part of his soul. Then came the moment. McPherson's voice crackled softly through the headset. Fire 1. 4 torpedoes shot from their tubes, streaking toward the convoy, white wakes glowing faintly beneath the surface. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. The first transport was split clean in 2, a thunderous blast that shook the night. Flames engulfed the deck as soldiers dove screaming into the sea. The second transport took a direct hit amidships and began to list hard to port. The Japanese destroyers opened fire instantly, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like blades. Tracers whizzed across the waves, close enough to hear them hiss. "Hard to starboard!" McPherson shouted. The PT boats whipped around, disappearing into their own smoke. The enemy fired blind, hitting only water and shadows. Within minutes, the American boats were gone, swallowed by the dark, engines roaring toward safety. Behind them, the horizon burned red. When dawn broke, reconnaissance confirmed it. 3 transports destroyed, thousands of Japanese soldiers lost. It was one of the most devastating ambushes Japan had suffered since Midway, and it had been done by 3 wooden boats, crewed by 12 men each, armed with courage and ingenuity. From that night on, the Imperial Navy no longer owned the darkness. They feared it. The men of Squadron 9 had proven that even the smallest weapons in the hands of the brave could change the course of war. When the smoke cleared over the Solomon Sea, only wreckage and silence remained. The mission had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had changed everything. For the first time, Japan's supply lines to Kolombangara were broken. The Tokyo Express had been stopped, not by battleships or bombers, but by a handful of men in wooden boats. In the weeks that followed, PT boats became a symbol of ingenuity and defiance. They struck fast, disappeared faster, and left behind stories whispered across the fleet. Sailors began calling them the Mosquito Fleet, small, relentless, and impossible to kill. Word of the Vela La Vela ambush spread all the way to Washington. Newspapers called it America's new secret weapon. Even President Roosevelt, himself a naval enthusiast, was said to have personally requested reports on the PT operations. But for the men who lived it, there was no glamour. They went back out, night after night, against impossible odds. Some never came back. Chief Petty Officer Thomas "Tom" Harrigan wrote in his journal, "We weren't heroes. We were just trying to get home alive, one night at a time." By the end of the war, PT boats had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese ships and transports. They had rescued downed pilots, carried out secret missions, and delivered chaos wherever the enemy least expected it. Yet when peace finally came, most of these boats were burned, sunk, or dismantled, their wooden hulls too fragile to survive in peacetime. Their legacy lived on not in steel or monuments, but in memory, in the courage of ordinary men who fought with speed instead of armor, in the lessons they taught, that technology alone doesn't win wars. People do. Today, only a few PT boats remain, restored in museums or kept alive by veterans' families. Their engines no longer roar, but when you stand on their decks, you can almost hear the echoes. The crash of waves, the rattle of machine guns, the faint hum of Packard engines slicing through the dark. They remind us of a truth that every sailor who faced the night learned to understand, that even in the deepest darkness, courage has its own light.